Welcome to the Engineering Seed podcast.
Well, welcome to the Engineering Seed, David. Could we just maybe start off with what was going on with you in university? Because I guess where you are now is completely different to what you were studying. It would just be good to maybe progress through your university and then even career as well, just to sort of get an understanding.
Yeah, sure. So I studied mechatronics when I was at university, which was still a fairly new degree at the time. And to be really honest, I just fell into software rather than a direct plan. When people who studied mechatronics, they tended to fall into either really much more hardware focused or software focused. So I was always much more drawn to the software side of things than the hardware. And then while I was at university, I did an industry placement at a company where I was basically writing software. And I sort of really liked it and fell into things from there. But I did find that the engineering degree was incredibly helpful. Because I found that also in working with other people and hiring other people, that it's a really structured way of learning and looking at things. And the same principles apply. So the idea of breaking things down into smaller modules, some of that stuff came down to machine design in sort of first and second year uni. And so I found that the specific technical things I learned at university probably weren't as directly useful. The way of thinking and the way of approaching things, I think, is 100% applied.
Yeah, awesome. So coming out of uni, did you just get this the first position you got, or was it something that you're actually actively looking for?
It was a bit more complicated. I did this industry placement with an architectural firm in the late 90s. And they had a very, very active technology section. And they were sort of branching out into project management, property construction software. That's a bit of a mouthful. And so this is kind of very early .com days, where you were basically trying to provide people with shared documents online and help people manage construction projects online. And I sort of, I took a year off uni at the end of third year, and worked there for a year full time. And then my final year, I worked part time there, and just stayed with that. I shifted to another company briefly, but eventually that company, the IT section of the company, split out, and we kind of formed an early startup, although we didn't call it a startup at the time. And push it, and sort of things grew from there.
How did you find doing that sort of year off uni and just working full time in a job? Do you think that was really helpful in your foundation, in your career, or was it sort of you look back and you wish you got it done quicker?
It's a really good question. I found that when I went back to uni after that year off, I was a lot more focused, and I think I'd learned actually, like my marks literally were 10% higher than they were before that, which is, I guess, one good outcome. I think I just had a little bit more sort of realistic approach to things. No, I don't regret it at all. But it was definitely interesting, kind of very, very different world. And it was also interesting coming back to uni because I really I valued some of the stuff at uni much more, having come from back from business for a little while.
Yeah, I think, for me, I also was working full time, but it was in my final year. So for me, it was like, I guess I wanted to get out of university, as opposed to if I was to do it maybe 1 or 2 years prior to that and then continue part time, maybe it could have shaped, I guess, what I would have studied. Because I guess for most of my uni, I was just going into a subject and just trying to get through it because I never really had an idea of where I wanted it to lead me to.
I think it's actually really hard because you can kind of walk into a career with a picture and you say, listen, I'm going to become the prime minister or whatever. And you've got this really clear sort of list of steps of where you're going to go. And in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. So I think you've just got to, but I think it's a really good idea to have a bit of a plan because it gives you a bit of a direction. But I think you've just got to be open to changes.
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, I was going to say in that year off, I was actually, I mean, these were the heady.com days. I was seriously considering not going back to uni, and I was thinking, oh, I'll go up to Silicon Valley and, you know,
Yeah.
make millions and all the rest of it. And but I am extremely glad that I went back and finished the last year, because I think
Yeah.
that was really, really valuable.
Yeah, in just a point of view of completing something and having that sort of record, or the skills as well that you got from uni.
Actually, both. So I think employers do value degrees. You know, it's not, and honestly, in technology, I don't know too many people in software who don't have a degree in something. Often it's not like it's often not a computer science degree. It's often something else. But there's that, and there is sort of value in, as an employer, looking at someone who's achieved something that's difficult. Like, it is actually difficult getting through a degree, particularly an engineering degree, I think. And so you're demonstrating to someone as well that you can achieve something, and something that's difficult, that's a hard slog, that's a marathon, it's not just a sprint. And then also I found that my final year of university was really, really good, because that was when we did a lot of group projects, and a lot of kind of more complex stuff, and also doing a thesis as well was was really good.
Okay. So on top of maybe a degree, are there any particular skills that you look for in employees and things like that, qualities of employees that you highly value?
Yeah, it's so there's a lot of, I mean, you kind of look for a lot of different things. So there's, like, obviously you're looking for some form of technical skills. So in my case, I'm hiring mostly for software. And so I'd probably look for skills with, you know, for hiring so I've worked across a lot of different languages and platforms and things. But suppose we're hiring people for a mainly JavaScript house, then, you know, obviously we're going to look at somebody who's written some JavaScript as kind of basic skills. But once you get kind of beyond that, I think I really, really look for attitude and aptitude. And so attitude's reasonably clear. Like, somebody who's positive, who's looking to try and get things done, who can kind of bring other people with them on a journey with that, and brings positivity, things can be really, really is something you really look for. But aptitude is also incredibly important, and that's really just the ability to learn. And the reason that's so important is, so it's so important for so many reasons. One of them is, no matter what you might know, when you go to a new job, it's a different environment, and things are going to be really, really different to what you might have experienced somewhere else. Even if the technology is the same, maybe the way that they use the technology is different. Maybe they've got different processes to manage that. You know, there's always something to learn. And the other thing is that the environment keeps changing. So, you know, my wife's a teacher, and I think, like, a generational change in teaching is about 20 years. You know, when something really significant happens that totally changes the way that people learn and how they structure teaching. And I think in software, it's and technology generally, it's probably about 5 years. And so things change so fast that people who can demonstrate the ability to learn and the aptitude to learn in that environment are really, really valuable.
Okay.
So they're the top things.
So thinking about a 5-year turnover on learning, do you have any idea on what sort of it looks like in the next 5 years, maybe for software in particular, on what you're going to be seeing, what you're going to be expecting people to sort of be able to learn and things like that?
It's the software. There's a bunch of things. There's a bunch of really broad trends that are happening. So across for the last 20 years, things have been just moving to higher and higher levels of abstraction. So, you know, if you look at it from a hosting, just a pure, like, infrastructure perspective, you've gone from servers that are, you know, blinking lights in a server room, to virtualized servers, to Docker containers, to pure serverless type architectures, with AWS Lambda and some of the other things like that. So I think you can expect to see that sort of trend continuing. where things move to an increasingly less bare metal kind of world.
Okay.
But then different organizations are at different stages in those journeys too. So it doesn't always completely stay there. One major challenge that I see for software, so that's kind of more a hosting kind of thing. For software, I think we're increasingly dealing with a world where software has to move to more parallelizable software. And so when you go back to kind of like everybody knows about Moore's law, which is basically really, really roughly that computing power roughly doubles every 18 months. It's not exactly what Moore said, but it's close enough.
Yeah.
All of those gains from 1970 through till about 2010, all of those almost all those gains were in processors that were single core processors that just got faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
But for the last, increasingly since 2010, and even much more since then, those gains have been by putting, yes, it's faster, but it's done by putting more cores on a chip. And what that means is that increasingly, in order to take advantage of that, code needs to be multi-threaded.
Yeah.
And that becomes, it's a really, really challenging problem because multi-threaded code is much harder to write.
Yeah.
And so that's then driven other changes. So there's increasingly a rise in more functional programming languages.
Yeah.
So languages like Erlang and Elixir and those sort of techniques, and there's many of them, which and make it easier to parallelize code.
Okay.
Because they kind of build that parallelization into the way that the code is written.
Yep.
So I think you can expect to see more and more of that sort of stuff turning up in languages, and languages being driven much more in that direction.
Yeah. I just wanted to loop back to what we were talking about with skills of people.
Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to ask, how much do you value people just sort of going about learning different software or whatever, I guess, their profession might be? How much do you value that? Do you look at, I guess, for software, do you look at their GitHub and things like that? And if so, what in particular things do you look for? Anything that sort of is more outstanding than something else?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I look for people who have experienced in more programming languages.
Okay.
And there's a lot of research out there that says, well, actually, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there that says people, you often being exposed to another programming language, and also the community around the language, they've often got different styles. You can bring some of those lessons back to another language, and so you can apply a slightly different way of thinking, and it just gives you a much more rounded approach to things and a much better understanding of things. So absolutely, for me, I look for that because it's also, the other thing is, it's a demonstration of someone's ability to learn.
Yeah.
Which, coming back to that, is still really, really valuable. So that if you can demonstrate that you've written, you've worked with a functional style language, say like Python or something, and a more kind of object-oriented language, and like a set-based, so like Java or something, and you've worked with like a set-based language like SQL, that demonstrates you've seen skills across a bunch of useful areas that we could apply somewhere else. So that's definitely really, really valuable for me. The other thing is, if you've done something that's really hard, and maybe something that's kind of like it's almost like a hierarchy of languages, which people kind of this is harder than that language.
Okay.
So if you've touched something like Erlang or Elixir or some of the slightly more exotic functional languages, and demonstrated something quite difficult, then I think that shows it's almost more that you've climbed a mountain, and people, you can see that they've climbed a mountain. So
awesome. So your career, to me, I could be wrong, but it seems like you've had the career of being involved in many smaller, like, startup companies throughout your time, and I guess in this day and age, it's pretty popular to do. What has it been about the companies that you've sort of been involved in? Maybe some weren't as good as others, but what characteristics do you sort of look for in companies where you see opportunity for growth? You know, certainly for the company and for yourself. Like, what are there sort of things, commonalities, or anything like that you find?
Well, for me personally, I look for a chance to have an impact.
Yep.
So, and one of the reasons I like sort of smaller companies and startups, and it does depend on what your definition of a startup is.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I like them is because there's a better chance of having an impact.
Yep.
And so that if you go work for a really large company, it's more like you're a passenger on the train. So you can't really choose the direction and you can't change that. It does mean that you can possibly get a lot more done in some ways because the larger companies do genuinely have a lot more resources. But in startups, you can genuinely have a positive impact and feel like you're made a change in the world. So going back to that with the definition of startups, I would argue that a startup is a company that hasn't actually achieved product market fit. And a really good example of that is if they're not profitable.
Yeah.
So I would argue that there's, and I think once you get beyond that, I think you're a small company.
Okay.
So I worked for example, I worked for Prosper, when Prosper was profitable for all of the period of time of its entire existence as a company. But at least certainly in the time up to the time I was there. So I wouldn't call that. I think it's called a startup, but from my perspective, it's not 100% a startup.
Of course.
But you genuinely can have an impact at a smaller company. The other thing is from a experience perspective, startups are and smaller companies are really accelerated learning.
Yeah.
So you can really get to see kind of all the cradle to grave of something. You can be involved in building some software. You can be involved in talking to customers. You can be involved in seeing it go into production. You can see what the result of it is with customers and get some of the feedback. You can deal with difficult people. You can get a lot more experience and a lot more intense experience in a startup. But they can be pretty exhausting as well. It's part of the trade-off.
Fair enough.
But one thing that's also quite different in a startup as well to a larger company is really ownership. So when you're at a small company or a startup, you can't really say that something else is not your problem.
Yeah.
You really kind of need to own the outcomes of whatever's being delivered. And so you can't sort of do your little bit in the corner and then say, hey, this is a problem for an infrastructure team to deploy it, or I've written my code and it works on my machine.
Yeah.
It does give you that real experience of ownership and ownership of sort of delivery. Which is really good and bad. Generally good, but when it goes wrong, it's not so fun.
I just had another thought about you getting into programming. Was it something that throughout uni you just tended towards, or were you actively experiencing different things, whether that's through extracurricular activities, maybe more formally just in uni and tending to do the software side and just finding that you enjoy it? Was there anything in particular that you did?
Yeah, look, I read all these histories of people and stories about how they started programming and they had a C64 and they fell into it from being a kid, and that just wasn't me. So the first time I touched programming was at uni, and I didn't do necessarily a huge amount of stuff outside that, but it was something I really enjoyed, and I just enjoyed more than I did some of the other things. And so it's just kind of, I guess I really did just fall into it, rather than anything else.
And I guess maybe to finish up, just thinking about the current times that we're in and contextualizing it, have you, I don't know if working from home has been new to you or you've been doing it on and off, but what are some things that you are finding, and maybe tips for people that are, whether they're studying from home or working from home, what are you appreciating about employees, and maybe any sort of tips that you found to be helpful for you?
Well, it's a really difficult time, to be really honest. At Bench specifically, we had a little bit of a culture of working from home some of the time. So across my team, which picks up the product and the dev team, we had part of the team is 100% remote and works from home already. But
Okay.
across the rest of the company, and even in the rest of the product and dev team, that wasn't the case. And so while we have we're 100% cloud hosted, we have all the tools so that people can work from home. It's a big adjustment for people to work from home 100% of the time. Like, it's genuinely a big shift. It's not the same as, a day a week somebody works from home. So the biggest, it's been an interesting shift. One of the biggest challenges is that a lot of work is really collaborative, and you really need to work with other people. It's not just an individual contribution. And so working from home can be really, really productive if you have a really self-contained piece of work that you yourself own. But when you're trying to work as part of a team, it's much, much harder. So one of the changes that we've done is to really try and support more and more of that communication. And so that you've had, when people are in an office or a shared space, there's a lot that happens that's really valuable. People just walk past each other and then they realize, hey, I need to ask that guy something. And so that's like sparks conversations. And you just don't have that at home. And the same thing as well with social interaction. So there's a lot of, people actually need to spend time together, and it really recharges people to be able to have a little bit of a chat to people, a bit of banter around the office and things like that. So we've done a lot of work to just try and build a bit of structure that helps support more of that. So some examples of that are, we normally have a stand up at the end of the day, but we've added another one in the morning where we just catch up, and it's a little bit of social chit chat and how's the day been and what are you planning to do? But it creates more opportunities for people to talk and to just sort of kind of look after each other and check that everybody's okay as well. So that's one thing we've done. The other thing I've noticed is that I think it's harder to draw a really good separation between when work stops and when home starts. Particularly if everybody's able to be remote. And so, I think some basic things about trying to have a separate workspace where you can say, this is where I'm working and this is where I'm at home and relaxing. I think that's a really good idea. And I think also trying to build some structure into your day. So, using calendar time to actually block out time to do things, like if you want to go for a walk and get fresh air, because it is actually really important. And blocking out time to interact with people socially, to look after yourself, to get some exercise, all those things. Use tools like Zoom and other things to talk to people over video rather than just maybe on the phone, because much, much better to help kind of just to see somebody else and to convey a bit of emotion. So
and even just seeing the people's environment that they live in as well can occasionally spark conversation and just to get to know each other a bit better.
I mean, there's lots of conversation about that. It's been quite hilarious, and what people are doing. And another colleague who suggested moving where he's working pretty regularly, so that just helps keep him motivated and the rest of it. We've had other fun things like just other skills, encouraging people to sort of chat as well. Like we have people share, now that everybody's stuck at home, people are cooking more. So people are sharing recipes they're cooking through Slack, that sort of thing. So I think you try to create more opportunities that help keep people connected. It's much, much easier for people to kind of fall below the radar and to kind of really lose some of that social contact. So
Well, David, thank you so much for blocking out some time for me today.
Not a problem.